Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So, hope that everybody is keeping well wherever might be. And yesterday was the Patimokkha day for monks. And so, actually over the last couple months I've had this ankle injury. So I haven't been able to go to the Patimokkha. I've kind of just been here most of the time. Some of the time, the first few months, kind of not doing much walking. So the Buddha actually recommends for monks that every 2 weeks they go to the Patimokkha. And there's this story where there's a monk who's an arahant. It's in the Vinaya. And he thinks to himself, well, I'm already an arahant. Why should I go to the Patimokkha? I'm purified with the highest purification. And the Buddha appears in front of him and says, if you Brahmins, he called arahants Brahmins, don't honor the Patimokkha, then who will? So the Patimokkha was something that the Buddha gave a huge amount of emphasis to. Actually, his name for his religion is Dhamma-Vinaya. So one half of the religion is the Vinaya. And Vinaya is the rules, the black and white lines for monks. He gave so much prominence to them. There's a sutta called the Uposatha Sutta. He says, just as the ocean is stable and doesn't kind of overlap its boundaries, and so too the disciples, the Buddha says, so too disciples of mine don't transgress training rules laid down by me, even for the sake of their life. He gave quite a lot of prominence to the Patimokkha and to the many, many rules that exist under the Patimokkha. Actually, in total, the Patimokkha is 227 rules. Underneath those rules are subclasses, and then there's a whole other section of the Vinaya besides the Patimokkha that has many, many, many what you call minor rules, kind of their dukkatas and kind of protocols and these things. One of the interesting things is that it's notable whenever you have a tradition, like a group of monks or a tradition, where they start to keep the Vinaya strongly and they start to practice meditation, then there's rumors. You can never say these things are true or not. There's rumors that people have noble attainments. So before, actually, about 150 years before, everybody in most places in the Theravada world believed that Nibbana was no longer possible. But then around the same time, around 2,500 years after the Buddha's passing, in all three Theravada countries, mainly in Thailand and then Burma, meditation got revived. And in all three Theravada countries, forest movements restarted and revived the Vinaya. And then in all three Theravada countries, again, there were these rumors of people who attain these stages that were possible in the canon once again. So there's another really important sutta where the Buddha says, he says, basically train in the Patimokkha seeing danger in the slightest faults. And says, the training can be comprised under 3 types of training. Training in the higher wisdom, training in the higher mind, and training in the higher virtue. And basically that the Patimokkha helps to encompass all of these things. He says, those who attain a part, attain a part. Those who attain a whole, basically paraphrasing here, attain the whole. And he says, the Patimokkha rules, or the discipline, I tell you, is not in vain. One of the interesting things with the Vinaya is that because it impinges on so many aspects of a person's life and in such minor detail, then there's always a tendency, there's always a temptation to regard the Vinaya rules as guidelines. And so some of the things in the Vinaya, like there's protocols, those actually are guidelines. But the Buddha never really uses the word guideline when he talks about the Vinaya. it becomes very prominent. Actually, I was listening to a kind of a recorded session, and there was one monk who was saying, good monks aren't monks who keep the Vinaya perfectly. Good monks are monks who grow in wholesome qualities and decline in unwholesome qualities. And this is true to a certain extent. Half of it's true. If you're a good monk, then you grow in wholesome qualities, you decline in unwholesome qualities. But good monks keep the Vinaya perfectly and grow in wholesome qualities, decline in unwholesome qualities. Sometimes as well, the Vinaya and the Dhamma are seen as things that are like antagonistic. It's like, if you know the Dhamma well, then you know when to break the rules in the Patimokkha. And this extends actually, this can extend into lay people's sila. Well, you use my wisdom when to keep this and not. When we look into the canon, the Buddha lays these things down as more or less black lines in most cases. In the Vinaya, it's kind of clear sometimes when things are a protocol. In the Sakya rules, there's these rules about deportment. If you break those disrespectfully, then you get an offense. But if you don't break them out of disrespect, then you don't get an offense. So you just want to keep them most of the time, but there's leeway there. Almost all the other ones are are a black line, a black and white line. So one of the reasons that people tend to think that the Dhamma and Vinaya are antagonistic is because it can be very inconvenient to remember all of the different rules in the Patimokkha and then apply them. And also it can be inconvenient sometimes when one wants to do something, one is stopped by the Vinaya. But the way that the Buddha has set up sila in general, both for lay people and for monks, is that these things are like guardrails on a highway, or they're like rails on the side of the road. I mean, there can be some pretty things on the side of the road, or there might be some paths that look nice to go down on the side of the road, but you go down there and your car can get stuck. It can seem wide at first, and then you get lost. It's very difficult to turn around. And in a similar way, when a monk or a tradition or a person starts to break rules in very minor ways, it gets to be a bit like a slippery slope. After doing this for a short amount of time, it becomes very difficult for people to turn around and become strict again. To turn around and become restrained again. Actually, what tends to happen is it gets more and more and more lax until it becomes obvious to people that things are lax. And this is when actually people stop believing. They stop having faith that these things are possible, that the things that the Buddha taught about are possible again in the modern day. So these Patimokkha rules, although they're small, some of them are small. They're what are called dukkata rules. They're kind of like a very minor rule. I mean, if you get a dukkata for walking on the floor with wet feet, and you get a dukkata for walking on the floor with unwashed feet. And the gray areas are, how do you determine how wet your feet have to be, or how unwashed they have to be? So that's a gray area. But in any event, these are minor rules, and breaking them becomes like the thin end of the wedge. So I remember there was one senior monk one time, he was commenting to me, or commenting to us when I was a junior monk. He was a really impressive, inspiring senior monk. And he was talking about these rules in specific, that you wipe your feet before you come in. So usually you have to have mats laid out so you can wipe your feet and wash your feet before you go, or clean them at least. And he said, sometimes they have these really big events, these big monastic events, and there's no foot wiping cloths, there's no buckets of water. And people think, well, thousands of monks or whatever, or, 1,000 monks, there's a huge number of monks, and so, we just can't be bothered with these things. But he was commenting that it was really important to bother with them. And the canon would have his support. The Buddha would support that. And there's another sutta called the Pankada Sutta. And there's this monk listening to a talk that the Buddha gives, and he's talking about all these very, what you might call like minor rules, it sounds like, in the Vinaya. And this monk thinks to himself, oh, this ascetic is much too strict. He's one of the Buddha's monks. So the Buddha gives the talk and he leaves and he sets out somewhere. And later this monk is stricken, his conscience is stricken. He's like, oh, what did I do? It's not a gain for me, it's a loss for me that I thought this way when the Buddha was giving a talk. So he actually leaves the place where he is and goes wandering to track the Buddha down. And he finds the Buddha and he confesses what he did. And the Buddha says, yeah, indeed it's a flaw, paraphrasing here, that what you did, but since you recognize it and confess it, then we forgive you. It's growth in a noble one's discipline, when one recognizes one's mistakes and confesses them. Then he goes on to say something interesting. He says, if a monk isn't keen on the training, then I don't praise him. Whether he's like basically a new, from my memory, that part, whether he's a new bhikkhu or an elder bhikkhu, whatever it might be. And he says, why is that? It's because other monks might follow his example, and that would be for their long-term harm and suffering. So here, again, the Buddha equates the Vinaya with the training. The kind of, you can't just keep the Vinaya, you have to practice meditation too. But there is that sutta where he says that the threefold training is basically, the Vinaya kind of at least covers that. Supports it at least. I think he uses the word comprises, like it kind of covers it. So the Buddha always gives it an immense amount of importance. Now the interesting thing was, right before the Buddha died, he gave this allowance. He said, monks, if you'd like, it was one of the last things he said before he died, or before he attained parinibbana, if you'd like, you can get rid of the lesser and minor rules. And so Mahakassapa, he soon after the Buddha passed away, there was an old monk, and he said, don't be sad that the Buddha passed away. We were always troubled. He said, we were always troubled by the Buddha telling us, do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this, and now we'll do whatever we want. So Mahakassapa convenes the first council, and they recited the Vinaya, so that the Vinaya and the Sutta, so that these kind of monks would not become strong in the Sangha. Now, one of the things that when this is said is kind of, the minor rules are not important. But here the Buddha is likely making a double point. One is that you can probably still attain Nibbana, even if the minor rules are not followed. However, the more important point that's often missed, and in the lead up to the Buddha's death, he started to praise Mahakassapa. There's a Samyutta called the Kassapa Samyutta. He says, basically, either I should exhort the bhikkhus or you should exhort the bhikkhus, Kassapa. And there's all these different suttas where he's basically there's suttas where he's basically praising Mahakassapa. He says, the Buddha says, I achieve these jhanas whenever I like, so too does Kassapa. And he said, I exhort you with Kassapa, or the example of one like Kassapa. So the impression that one gets is that the Buddha knew that Mahakassapa would have this great role after he died. And so his statement can be seen in these two ways. Number one, that you can still attain Nibbana without following the minor rules. But number two, the Vinaya is still really important. And he probably knew what Mahakassapa would do. So he left it to the Sangha whether to abrogate the minor rules or not, and led by Mahakassapa, the Sangha itself decided to keep them. So what we have is the Buddha giving a huge amount of emphasis to these rules and their importance. What we have is a history where whenever the Vinaya rules get lost, so too does the belief that Nibbana is possible. And we have the example of Mahakassapa and the Sangha, that they decided to keep all of the rules. And indeed, even today, even in the modern world, amazing things happen. When monks want to keep the rules, there's almost always a way to do it. Even in the middle of busy North American cities, you can still find a way to keep all of the rules in the Vinaya perfectly. And there's no other legal code in the world that you can really do that with. It's kind of the genius of the Buddha that he was able to lay down the Vinaya in this way. Even in the origins to the Vinaya, it said that's one of the reasons why the dispensations of previous Buddhas had declined and his lasted a long time. So, going to this Patimokkha after being kind of incapacitated for a long time was very uplifting. It was something very, very excellent. And just the ability of the Sangha to come together, to meet together, to reestablish their shared commitment to training in the way that the Buddha laid out. It gives a chance for the Sangha to meet. It's uplifting to see fellow monks practice, and when one leaves the Patimokkha, returns to whatever dwelling one is dwelling in, one has this sense of uplift. That the Sangha is still keeping the traditions that the Buddha laid down alive. And as the Buddha says in the Digha Nikaya, so long as the bhikkhus practice rightly, then the world won't be free of arahants. So long as the Vinaya is upheld, so long as the Dhamma is practiced, then the way to Nibbana is always open, because it's timeless. So it's always something wonderful to keep in mind. That this sila, whether it's for monks or lay people, is something to keep in its smallest details, seeing danger in the smallest flaws. Because as the Buddha says, these training rules, he tells us, are not in vain. Okay, so I think leave that for reflection, and wishing everybody all the blessings of Dhamma practice.